The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me on this episode is Michael Slobodchikoff. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Patrick Deneen. Dr. Deneen is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining the faculty of Notre Dame in 2012, he taught at Princeton and at Georgetown University. He has multiple impressive works, including Why Liberalism Failed, which has been translated into over 20 languages, and most recently, Regime Change Towards a Post-Liberal Future. Dr. Deneen, Patrick, welcome to the program from South Bend.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. Welcome again. And I wanted to ask you about when you were at Rutgers, you were impacted by de Tocqueville. And what did that the French philosopher thought? What did it mean for American democracy today?
Yeah, you've done your research. As a freshman at Rutgers University, which is where I started my university journey, never seemed to have finished it. I was assigned to read big chunks of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America by the man who became my major intellectual influence and mentor. Wilson Carey McWilliams was his name, a great scholar of American political thought. And as a freshman, 18 years old, coming from big public high school, I hadn't been exposed to really much philosophy. Certainly, political philosophy was new to me. And reading Tocqueville, beginning that journey of encountering a great thinker, and particularly a thinker who was writing and speaking about the still very young American democracy in the 1830s, it spoke to me profoundly as just in a very personal way. I grew up in New England. I grew up outside of Hartford, Connecticut. In fact, I grew up in what's considered and what we brag about as the oldest town in Connecticut, the first town that was settled by a small band that had left the Massachusetts Bay Colony to strike out for new territory. Windsor, Connecticut, founded in 1633. And Tocqueville, of course, famously has these very poetic passages praising the township democracy and praising the spirit, sort of public spiritedness, and the way that the township acted as a kind of a school, a primary school for democratic citizenship. And it just spoke to me profoundly because of the nature of the town that I grew up at the time, a very close-knit community in which you knew not only all of the families around you, but the people who owned the businesses in the town were the parents of the kids I went to school with. They were the kind of backbone of the town in terms of sponsoring events, scholarships, parades. It just felt to me, Tocqueville put into words what I had loved about my upbringing, and I realized that I had experienced a kind of the realization of a certain set of philosophical ways of thinking about American democracy. And that insight has never left me or my work, which is sort of how is our experience of everyday life in our countries, in our nation, in our places, how is this actually a kind of reflection of a deeper substratum of philosophical assumptions? And that's really been the kind of, I would say, the source of the work that I've done now as a sort of professional scholar.
Excellent. During the Cold War, the United States presented liberal democracy as something attractive to the world. Today, American democracy is suffering from many problems, including economic inequality, the breakdown of the family, addiction to pharmaceuticals, and a loss of purpose. Liberalism is no longer attractive within the West. What caused this?
Yeah, in some ways you could say I suppose the difficulties right now, to put a positive spin on it, the difficulties, if not the outright failures that liberalism is now undergoing, in some ways are the very consequences of the seeds that were planted during its seeming ascendancy, during and then particularly at the end of the Cold War. And if we think back to the Cold War, America really began to understand, I would say American intellectual elites began to understand America itself as a kind of ideological project. So in response to the ideological challenges that were being faced in Europe, first with fascism and then with communism, America developed, I would say in particular the intellectual world developed a self-understanding of American political order as an ideological counterbalance to these ideological movements in Europe, in the Soviet Union. And this idea, and I suppose it's fair to say that ideologies can capture something true, but to the extent they're ideologies, they begin to force the facts of reality, the crooked timber of humanity, to use the kind of Kantian Isaiah Berlin phrase. It forces those kind of complex aspects of our human reality into the ideological Procrustean bed of its ideas. And we could say this is, of course, what led to the downfall of the Soviet Union, the effort to fit the crooked timber of humanity into the ideology of communism, claiming that all human beings were capable of overcoming self-interest, that we would no longer have property, we would no longer have any particular affection for our own families, for our own peoples, that communism was an ideology that was a deformation of some things that are good, the quality of being a certain selfless ideal of human beings, but takes that to an extreme and ultimately undermines whatever is good about that in the name of the ideology. And I would say the same thing happened in the United States, which is that we went from being, I think, broadly speaking, a kind of having a broadly liberal worldview, but it was not ideologically liberal. It was, you could say, a lot of different ways of life that people were more or less capable of living. They came to America to live and flourish in this country and didn't have to conform to sort of one ideological vision of what it was to be an American. And over the course of the Cold War, and then especially with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and the publication, of course, the now famous or maybe infamous article by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, really it was a kind of declaration of the ideological triumph of liberalism. And what that meant now was that America understood its own self and its project as an ideological project that had no peer and had no competition. And over the course then of the next 20, 25, 30 years, kind of what happened is the entirety of the American political, social, economic order increasingly had to conform to this set of liberal ideological views, and to the point in which the same thing that had happened in the Soviet Union was now happening in the United States. All of these pathologies that grew out of the idea that we were radically autonomous individual selves, that the market had to have no barriers, no boundaries, that human beings understood themselves as self-making, self-willed creatures. Look at all the pathologies. We have, enormous, profound economic inequalities resulting from this economic system. We have, of course, the breakdown of all kinds of social institutions and practices, starting with the family, but moving up through townships like my own hometown of Windsor, Connecticut, that's now a shell of its former self under the kind of duress of, kind of the chain storification of America and the destruction of so many downtowns in the name of cheap prices and convenience and parking lots. So I suppose it's fair to say then that America, unbeknownst to itself, even as it was celebrating its victory in the Cold War, it turned out to be something of a Pyrrhic victory. And the question I think that we now face is, are we capable of sort of restoring a non-ideological understanding of America that follows this period of liberal ideological ascendancy?
I'd like to follow up for 1 second. And talk about when you described the end of communism in the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet period. A lot of people had already stopped believing in the values of communism. They didn't believe it in the ideology. They'd go to work, they'd profess the ideology, but they'd live completely different. And they saw it as a shell, which very quickly came down. And when I started working here and teaching, a lot of my students in American government would talk about the American dream, American ideology. They'd believe it. But over time, that has eroded, and the students no longer believe that it is possible to live better than their parents, or to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, or believe in an American ideal. How has this affected the belief in the greatness of America, and what problems does this have for the future of America?
Yeah, I mean, it's really. Of course, I'm seeing the same thing. I teach. I've taught at. You mentioned Princeton, Georgetown, my previous employers and institutions, and Notre Dame. I've really taught at some very prestigious institutions with students that are really destined for, fabulous futures and careers, and yet they are ridden with anxiety and deep concern about their own future. So this is epidemic among a younger generation, even among those who seem to have caught the golden ring. But even if we put aside the kind of college-age students, we were already, I would say America was already in the midst of this kind of crisis of self-understanding, what Jimmy Carter years ago called the crisis of confidence, if you'll remember. That was already being experienced in parts of the country that were not really being heard, that were not, in which the citizens would vote often for a succession of leaders, political leaders at both the state and the national level, and they would change their votes from party to party in order to correct what they saw as the shortcomings of the current either Republican or Democratic administration at the state or mostly federal level, because they believe that at some level the system would be responsive to them. And yet for decades, the system was entirely unresponsive and kept going on the same path of deindustrialization, of outsourcing of factories, of outsourcing of jobs, and then the kind of consequent and attendant destruction of those communities. Again, somebody like J.D. Vance is, of course, a very, you could say kind of like almost the paradigmatic representative of someone who experienced this in his personal life growing up in Middletown, Ohio, a deindustrialized Rust Belt town that was once flourishing and now had really been hollowed out by a lot of decisions that were being made by elites in Washington, D.C. and across the globe. And so I think already what we were experiencing, long before we had the kind of populist revolution, we were already experiencing that loss of confidence in the American dream, but it wasn't registering in the places where it ought to be registering. So I think now we've gone so far past the point of relatively easy correction. Now we're faced with, I think as you're describing, a kind of systemic wide loss of that confidence, especially in a younger generation. And here I don't really quite know, I'm not in a position to know exactly, the answer to this, but I do think, in a way, a version of the old answer is not incorrect. A version of the old answer was, you should have faith and hope in the future. You should have the belief that this nation can provide for you a good life. But it won't come automatically, and it won't come without rebuilding. The rebuilding of a lot of the kinds of institutions and practices that actually were undermined over the course of the last few decades. And that's where I think the kind of the current political dysfunction makes this extraordinarily difficult to answer those anxieties.
I'm going to turn to education and ask, how does Homer's Odyssey, which is something you focused on in the past, mean for American democracy, and why is it essential to study the great works today?
That's a bit of a turn of a topic.
It is.
But it's not unrelated. It's not unrelated because maybe I'll come back to the Odyssey. But let me at least just broach the topic of liberal education. Liberal education, which of course is a very noble, deep and noble tradition, not only of course in the United States, but broadly speaking in the West. I mean, the West, in a sense, you could say, going all the way back to antiquity and the academy founded by Plato and the school founded by Aristotle and the great universities of the Middle Ages, liberal education is the legacy, one of the preeminent legacies of the West. But I think, as a nation and as a modern civilization, we've lost what had been the understanding of what the purpose and end of liberal education was, which was the teaching of liberty, right? As the name suggests, the educating a new generation in what it is to be free. In other words, freedom, to be a free human being, is not natural to us, right? It's not something that you can just, like knowing how to eat food or knowing how to scratch an itch. It's not something that you just know instinctively. It's something you actually have to learn. In a liberal political order such as ours, especially the ideological form that it's taken, there's a deep underlying assumption that freedom is natural, that in our natural condition, our instinctive condition, we are free. In other words, it replicates that idea of freedom that existed or that was posited at the time of the sort of philosophical founding of the liberal tradition, kind of the social contract tradition, the state of nature theory. In other words, if we look at human beings in their natural condition, their natural state, take them out of whatever particular society they live in, whatever particular laws that might govern them, whatever particular culture, religion they might have, then we'll find human beings in their natural condition, and the natural condition of human beings is to be free. So you could say the modern assumption of freedom is that it's not something that has to be learned, it's something that's instinctive. And so what we have to learn then in some ways is how to maximize our freedom while preventing its sort of worst, its kind of worst aspects, its worst consequences. And this is why I think in a modern educational setting, how it is that we maximize freedom is particularly by expanding our ability to conquer nature. And so the STEM disciplines become very important, right? Our ability then to manipulate and master the natural world, including human nature, now becomes a major object by this understanding, the modern understanding of freedom, as well as the economic sciences. So in other words, increasing wealth, increasing our ability then to take the mastery of nature and turn that into wealth being the sort of form in which we can enjoy our thoroughgoing freedom. The wealthier you are, the freer you are, right? So this natural form of freedom can be expanded, can be amplified, but it doesn't have to be in some senses learned. And this is where then I would come back to the understanding of liberal education. Why it's so desperately needed today is that it proposes a different understanding of freedom, or a different understanding of liberty, that liberty is something that has to be learned, and liberty is basically a form of self-discipline. It's the achievement of the capacity of self-governance. It's governing our lowest aspects of our nature, our raw desires, our appetites. It's governing. It's learning the governance of ourselves, putting ourselves politically under law, and laws that we follow. So this is the actual definition of democracy you encounter in Aristotle, that it's the activity of rule and being ruled in turn. So we have these kind of two concepts of liberty that you could say they sometimes interact, but they are largely treated as somewhat separate, and one has come to predominate. And as a result, liberal education has kind of faded and decreased as a result of this, you could say, this more modern understanding of liberty. So I think, to the extent, especially that we as a nation, it seems, do need to exercise the muscles of civic self-governance that Tocqueville, of course, praises. We are very much in need of a revival of that more classical understanding of liberal education.
I'd like to turn to a related topic, but just a little different. You've written before that technology in our time actually works to undermine and destroy culture, and ironically works to undermine our knowledge. What role does technology play in the crisis that you described we face today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it actually does follow quite directly on what I was just saying. So I don't actually argue that technology is the sort of source of our woes. What I what I think is worth really underscoring is that we are the technological creature. I know we're called Homo sapiens, we're the knowing creature, but maybe even more than the knowing creature, we're the technological creature. In other words, we're the one creature, arguably, that exists that could not exist. We could not survive without our ability to create techne in the ancient Greek understanding of that word. In other words, the Greeks sort of divided the world between that which existed by nature, sort of trees and weeds and air and water, and that which existed by techne. In other words, that which we fashioned, that which didn't exist by nature. And so human beings are the creature that maybe above all are able to exist because of techne. Right? I know that birds make nests and chimpanzees can use sticks to get ants, but there's no creature that is so reliant upon technology, the fashioned objects, right? The ability to make clothes and housing and to ultimately develop agriculture, to hunt, to all of the arts, all of the sciences, everything, everything that we're looking at right now, with the exception maybe of our skin and our eyes and our facial hair, is all techne. And even our facial hair, Doug, you had to shave and shape that. So that's got a lot of techne involved in it. We're all wearing glasses. Our eyes are not untechnological. So techne and technology is the human condition. And so in a way, what I want to articulate is that culture is kind of the ultimate technological achievement of human beings. If by culture, I don't mean just like going to the theater, high culture, or having a cultural evening. I mean the vessel by which humanity has stored and kind of a treasure house of its shared knowledge and understanding that allows it to pass on this knowledge of how to be a human being in the world. It passes it on from generation to generation. And in a sense, you could say this is, of course, also a key feature of education. Education is this ability to pass on from one generation to the next, not just what I know because of what I've experienced, but what I've learned from previous generations and what previous generations have left to us. The library is one of the great cultural sort of achievements of humanity, the storehouse of this ancient understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. However, technology is double-edged, and going all the way back to the Greeks, it was recognized that technology had not only the capacity to allow human beings to flourish, but of course it has this very great threat of undermining our flourishing. And this was, of course, understood that every tool can become a weapon. Atomic energy can be, of course, an atomic weapon. But also, I think today we're seeing ever more clearly that technology actually undermines this thing I'm describing as culture. It actually is a kind of anti-cultural tool that allows us the belief that we no longer need that kind of treasure house of older knowledge. And so if we think about the ways that especially a younger generation is being raised today, it's almost without any knowledge or understanding of the past, any knowledge or understanding of how things work, how you would read a map, or how you would grow food, or how you would do some basic things maybe some of us grew up knowing, how to fix things. Just a complete lack of awareness of sort of things, how things work in the physical world. We become these kind of Gnostic creatures who exist in this virtual world. And this is actually destructive of this phenomenon of culture that I'm describing. So it's this aspect of technology that I think is especially worrying, and it makes it then very difficult for us to achieve that condition of freedom that I was describing in my previous response, that we have this, I think, false belief that we have achieved freedom from the world, freedom from the stuff of the world, freedom from the past, freedom from other human beings, freedom from reliance on other human beings. So it's this anti-cultural aspect of technology that I think we should be most worried about. And to understand that the answer isn't to be anti-technological, the answer is in some ways to understand the ways that technology and certain kinds of technology are really worthy of our support, attention, and perhaps in some ways a kind of revivification at some level.
Excellent. Patrick, we only have a few minutes remaining, so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about your future writing projects and what you have on the agenda, what we should expect to see from you in the future.
Yeah, that's actually why I punted a little bit on the Homer question. I was anticipating this question that you might ask me, and I'm actually working right now on a pretty short book on the Odyssey, and this is hopefully timed to come out around the time of the Chris Nolan movie on the Odyssey that's coming out in July. You asked me that question about the Odyssey, I suspect, because you looked at my CV or did a little bit of research on me and discovered that I wrote on the Odyssey for my dissertation. This is actually my first book, is a study of the Odyssey and its influence over the history of political thought. And since I have this well of knowledge about the Odyssey that's been sitting dormant for about 35 years, I thought there was no better time to kind of revive that study that I'd done in a more popular form, timed not only with that film, but timed also with the 250th anniversary of the United States. So my hope is to write a short book, not only, I think, offering some reflections on why the Odyssey matters as a story, why it still matters to us and how we can still identify with it, but also to explore the ways that America is in many ways itself a kind of its own self-understanding is born out of and inspired by that archetypal story of the person that goes out into the world to explore new things, strange new lands, right? The Star Trek is the one version of this, but yet also deeply values home and homecoming and to be back home as a central feature of what it is to be an American. It's the simultaneous Odyssean feature of going out, being the pioneer, being the explorer, being the adventurer, being the tech guy that wants to go to Mars, but also understanding that we do that at some level to make a home for ourselves. And that's one of the first stories we have in Western civilization. And I think it's very deeply the American story. So we're all sort of Odyssean, and that's really what I want to draw out in this short book that I'm working on right now.
Fantastic. Well, it's been truly an honor for us to speak to you, and I know I personally have very much enjoyed this conversation. So thank you very much. We appreciate it, and thanks again for joining us today on International Insights.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.